My dad owns a gas station at the edge of our town, and I've helped him run it for over 6 years, doing all sorts of things. When it comes down to it, though, the job he always needed the most help with was just working the register. We had a lot of turnover in employees, so sometimes we'd have enough to cover all the day and night shifts. But sometimes we'd only have a few employees, which meant that me and my dad had to cover the shifts ourselves. During those few months when we were low on staff, I ended up working the overnight shifts. These were my least favorite shifts, mostly because they messed up my whole schedule outside of work, and I was always tired. I'd sit at the register, sipping on my coffee, trying to keep my eyes from shutting. On this particular night, it was extra hard to stay awake. The heavy rain outside seemed to lull me into a drowsy state. Something about the rhythmic tapping of the rain on the roof made me feel sleepy. Plus, the rain kept most customers away, leaving me with no one around to give me a reason to stay alert. It was around 1 a.m., 3 hours into my shift, when a car pulled into the gas station and parked by one of the pumps. It was a beat-up gray SUV. The car sat there for a good 5 or 6 minutes before the driver finally turned off the engine. A man got out, wearing a dark hoodie and black jeans. He walked around to the trunk, popped it open, and started grabbing gas cans. I watched as he brought out 3, filling each one and setting them down next to his car. But then he grabbed more, one after another, filling up probably 10 to 15 gas cans. It was strange. Once he finally hooked the pump back up, he stood next to the cans, which were now scattered across the ground, and just stared at them. At first, I thought he was counting them, but when a whole 2 minutes passed and he was still staring, I couldn't figure out what he was doing. Then, he turned around and looked at the shop, quickly looked away, my heart racing. A few seconds later, he walked in. He went straight to the back and stood behind one of the aisles out of my view. I could hear him shuffling through something on the shelf. My stomach tightened with unease. After a moment, he came up to the counter. He didn't say anything at first, just tossed a box of matches onto the counter. My stomach immediately dropped. I stared at the box, my mind racing, my thoughts flashing to the insane amount of gas cans he had just filled. "Come on, I gotta get going," the man said, almost yelling. I picked up the matches to scan them, but I knew I couldn't take the chance on something like this. My voice wavered as I said, "I'm not sure if I'm comfortable selling these to you." I was hoping he'd just understand and leave. But instead, he locked eyes with me and grinned. "What, you think I'm gonna burn a house down or something?" His smile stretched unnervingly wide. He held eye contact for a moment longer, and it felt like he was reading my every thought. Then, without warning, he threw his hands up, gave me the middle finger, and walked out. The whole exchange was so disturbing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. As he loaded the gas cans back into his SUV, I picked up my phone and called the police. I didn't have any concrete evidence, but something about the man set off every alarm in my head. I made it clear that I wasn't sure he was planning anything wrong, but I thought it was worth reporting. A minute later, the man drove away, and I was left to wonder what he was up to. I sat at the counter, feeling the weight of the situation on my chest, helping a couple more customers over the next 2 hours. But then, just as I was starting to relax, a cop car pulled in. 2 officers stepped out and pulled me aside, asking about the man I had reported earlier. They questioned me about every detail: the man's appearance, the car he was driving, what I had seen him doing. After the questioning, they gave me a cold, unsettling piece of news. "About an hour after your call," one of the officers said, "we received a call from a worried mother. Her husband had made a threat to burn their house down. With her and the kids still inside." He paused. They'd been arguing, and she hadn't called until she was sure he wasn't around. He'd gone missing after the fight, and at the time she called, he still hadn't been seen. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The officer continued, "He was last seen at your gas station. After they left, I stood in stunned silence, trying to process what they had said. The man's joke about burning a house down now felt too real. A whole week went by with no updates. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. So, I called the station, hoping for some kind of resolution. After confirming my connection to the case, they told me something that sent a chill down my spine. The man had been caught in the act. 2 nights after I'd made the call, he showed up again. He had been missing for 2 whole days and then suddenly reappeared in the middle of the night, pouring gasoline all over the property. The officers had been stationed outside the house, and thankfully, they were able to stop him before things went any further. Couldn't believe it. If I hadn't made that call, if I just let him walk away with those matches, it could have been infinitely worse. It was by far the most disturbing thing I'd ever been involved with, and I'll never forget how close I came to something far darker than I ever could have imagined. I worked at a gas station full-time for several years during my 30s. During my last few months there, I started to notice this guy who would come in every few days. At first, he seemed harmless enough, but something about him always felt off. In my opinion, he was very obviously a druggie. Every time he came in, he'd look like he'd been up for 3 days straight. Eyes bloodshot, his movements shaky, and his clothes disheveled. He would glance around the store, his gaze paranoid, as if he was worried someone might be watching him. He'd grab a few things to eat, usually just snacks, and rush out as quickly as he'd come in. He always paid in cash, and never seemed to struggle with counting his change. He would have the exact amount ready to go, making the transaction as quick as possible. He never said a word. He would come in, grab his things, and leave. That was it. At first, I didn't think too much of it. He seemed harmless enough. The only person he looked like he was hurting was himself with his drug addiction. But then, one night, things took a strange turn. It was 2 a.m. when he came in again, but this time he was acting differently. He walked through the door, looking more jittery than usual, pacing around the store like he couldn't settle down. He kept moving, step after step, looking more frantic by the second. After a couple of minutes, his behavior became even more bizarre. He had never stayed inside the store for this long before, and I couldn't understand why he was pacing, looking so restless. I glanced outside at the gas station lot. The place was empty, and no other cars were parked. The station was in an isolated area, far from any main roads, which made it impractical to walk to or from. It was too far, and there was no reason for someone to be walking around at that hour. I looked back at the man. He was still pacing, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Hey, are you all right? You want me to call someone to pick you up?" I asked, trying to offer some help. He stopped in his tracks and shot a look at me. His eyes were dark, sleepless, like he hadn't had a proper rest in days. Without saying a word, he rushed out of the store. I watched him walk past the pumps and head toward the road. He was walking briskly, his movements erratic. He didn't even look back as he disappeared into the night, until he was completely out of sight. I didn't think much of it at the time, but even for him, this was a bit much. The guy was weird, but that night he'd taken it to a new level. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the following night, the same thing happened. He came in again around 2 a.m., pacing around, acting frantic. He didn't grab anything from the shelves, just walked back and forth like he was looking for something, or maybe trying to escape from something. As soon as I asked if he needed anything, he rushed out of the store again, just like the night before. This time, I was honestly concerned for him, but I didn't know what to do. Then, the next night, he came in again. But this time, he was acting completely normal. He grabbed some food, paid in cash, and left quickly, just like he always used to do. After that, a whole week went by without him coming in. I had mostly forgotten about his strange behavior. It was a quiet Wednesday night when I was working the register, just like any other night. But then he drove up again. His truck parked in its usual spot, and he walked through the door slowly. This time, he didn't seem like his usual self. He stood in the middle of the store, staring at nothing in particular, his expression blank, like he was in some kind of shock. He looked extra tired, almost like he hadn't slept in days. He stood there for a moment, just staring, before walking to the food aisle. I tried not to stare at him, but I couldn't help but feel like something was off. He stayed in the store for almost 10 minutes, taking his time as if he had no rush, no place to be. It was so different from how he usually acted. He moved slowly, like he was purposefully dragging out the moment. Finally, he came up to the counter with a small bag of chips in his hand. He still had that blank look in his eyes as he placed the chips down and handed me cash. There was no urgency in his movements, no frantic energy like before. He was calm, too calm. When I rang up the food, he grabbed it without saying anything. But then, unexpectedly, he quietly said, "Thank you." I'd seen this guy for months, and this was the first time he'd ever spoken a single word. It was so out of character, and it left me feeling uneasy. I watched him walk out the door, and just as he reached his truck, he stopped for a brief moment. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. A moment later, I looked over and saw 4 men running up to him. They moved quickly, grabbing him aggressively, dragging him across the gas station lot. Before I could even react, they tossed him into a van that had pulled up out of nowhere. The van doors slammed shut, and just like that, they took off, leaving nothing but his truck sitting in the parking lot. When the police arrived, they ran the plates on the truck, but it didn't belong to the man. It belonged to someone else, his father, as it turned out. His father identified him when shown the security footage from the station. But other than that, no one had any answers. The 4 men in the van were never identified, and there were no traces of the man left behind. He simply vanished. He never turned up again. As I sit here now, looking back on that night, I can't help but think that I know exactly what happened. From what I saw, he probably never will. I'm a 26-year-old male, and this happened 2 years ago. At the time, I was finishing my university classes online and working a part-time job at a gas station. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid better than any other part-time gig. My shift was from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. 3 nights a week. This wasn't exactly the schedule I preferred, but I made it work. For the first few days, they had someone else working with me for training, but soon it was just me. They'd leave a list of tasks to complete during my shift, and usually it wouldn't take more than an hour to finish everything. The rest of the time, I'd either be on my phone or helping the occasional customer. It was a normal shift when this all started, nothing to indicate the nightmare that was about to unfold. The night began like any other. I checked in, grabbed a cart from the back room, and pushed it through the aisles, stocking anything that was low. I just moved to an aisle near the front when I heard the door open. I looked over the shelves, expecting to see someone at the counter, but there was no one there. I saw the door slowly creak closed, confirming that someone had entered, but they must have changed their mind or forgotten something in their car. It was nothing unusual. I continued working, lost in the monotonous tasks, and once I had finished, I rolled the cart back to the storage room and locked it up. I turned off the lights, ready to head back to the counter and take a short break, when I heard the front door creak open again. The sound was faint, but it was unmistakable. I rounded the corner, only to find the store once again empty. This time, I opened the door, peeking outside and scanning the parking lot. There were no cars at the pumps, and no sign of anyone walking nearby. I shrugged it off, locked the door, and went back to the register to scroll through my phone, not really thinking much about it. It was then I heard it. A soft thump, like something small had hit the back door. My heart skipped a beat. I froze. I waited for another noise, but nothing came. Just that single, quiet thump. For a moment, I thought it was nothing, but then a thought crept into my mind. Something wasn't right. I pulled up the security footage to check, just in case. I switched to the camera by the back door and froze. There, Standing completely still just outside the door was a man. His hand rested on the door handle, but he wasn't moving. He was just standing there, watching the door. I kept the camera open, my eyes glued to the screen. Slowly, I pulled up the footage for the front door, rewinding to the moment I heard the first sound. The footage showed the same man walking up to the gas station, pushing open the front door, and then running to the back of the building. He seemed to vanish out of view, only to reappear moments later, standing at the back door, still motionless. I felt the hairs on my neck stand up. This wasn't some random person walking by. I dialed 911, my fingers trembling as I reported the suspicious man. The call was barely connected when another thump came from the back door. I glanced at the security camera, and the man was now running around the building, heading for the front. Panic surged in my chest. I grabbed the phone and tossed it on the counter. My mind raced. What was this guy's plan? Was he going to break in? Was he armed? I hurriedly reached under the counter, pulling out the small pistol I kept there, just in case. My heart was pounding in my ears as I turned back toward the door, my grip tight on the gun. The man's footsteps grew louder, and then, suddenly, the door flew open. The impact was so violent that I was sure the glass would shatter. The man burst through the door, charging at me with terrifying speed. For a moment, he looked like he was coming for a fight, his eyes wild with something I couldn't quite place. But then, without warning, he stopped. His face twisted, and he turned on his heel, running back toward the back of the building. I heard a few loud thumps, like he was kicking a door. Then silence. I stood frozen, the gun still in my hand, my mind reeling. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. My hand reached for the phone again, and I resumed speaking with the 911 dispatcher, trying to keep my voice steady, despite the chaos in my chest. Minutes felt like hours, but 5 minutes later, I heard sirens wailing in the distance. Relief washed over me. Help was on the way. The 3 officers arrived cautiously, their eyes darting around, alert. They made their way to the back room, carefully navigating the building. I watched from behind the counter, not sure whether to feel fear or hope. They entered the back, and moments later, I heard their voices. They had found him. The officers later described him as being completely unaware of the situation, standing in the corner of the room, whispering to himself. In his hand, he was clutching a kitchen knife, but he didn't make a move when they approached. Instead, he lunged at them, attempting to stab one of the officers. Thankfully, they subdued him without anyone getting hurt. I was shocked when they told me he wasn't drunk or on drugs. The man didn't say a word about why he was there or what he'd been doing. It was as if he'd appeared out of nowhere, with no clear reason behind his actions. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something worse. As I closed up that night, my thoughts kept returning to the man. His blank, vacant stare, his whispering in the corner, the tension in the air, the fear that had gripped me. I was lucky I knew that, but luck doesn't always keep you safe. Sometimes there's no explanation, no reason for the terror. Sometimes the darkness is just waiting for the right moment to strike.